the lost books that could rewrite ancient history. Almost everything we know about the ancient world exists because someone chose to write it down. Across Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the Near East, scholars, poets, philosophers, and historians filled countless papyrus scrolls with stories of kings, wars, discoveries, and beliefs. These manuscripts preserved the rise of civilizations, the wisdom of great thinkers, and the triumphs and tragedies that shaped human history. For centuries, dedicated scribes copied these fragile texts by hand, allowing a small portion of them to survive into the modern age. Yet, what remains is only a fraction of what once existed. Most ancient literature has disappeared forever. Entire libraries have vanished. Thousands of scrolls have been destroyed by war, fire, neglect, or simply the passage of time. More than half of the Roman historian Tacitus' work has been lost. 3/4 of Livy's monumental history no longer survives. Over 80% of Aristotle's writings have vanished, along with every contemporary eyewitness account of Alexander the Great's campaigns. Countless other books disappeared so completely that we do not even know their titles. Every lost manuscript represents a missing piece of humanity's memory. But if historians could recover just one of these forgotten works, which would they choose? And what extraordinary secrets might those pages reveal? Among all the missing texts from antiquity, one stands above the rest for many Roman historians: the missing books of Tacitus' histories. Tacitus is widely regarded as one of Rome's greatest historians. His writings provide some of the clearest and most influential accounts of the Roman Empire during its most turbulent years. Originally, the histories stretched across more than a dozen books, chronicling some of the empire's most dramatic decades. Sadly, only the first 4 books and part of the 5th have survived. Everything that followed has been lost. This missing section is especially important because it covered one of the defining conflicts of the 1st century, the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome. In 66 CE, the Roman province of Judea erupted into open rebellion. Jewish resistance fighters launched a desperate struggle to free their homeland from Roman control and restore their independence. For Rome, however, rebellion was unacceptable. The empire responded with overwhelming military force. Today, our primary account of this devastating war comes from Josephus, a Jewish commander who eventually surrendered to the Romans and later wrote a detailed history of the conflict. His work is invaluable, yet it presents only one perspective. After changing sides, Josephus depended upon Roman patronage for his survival. His writings naturally portrayed the future Emperor Titus in a favorable light, while also attempting to explain the tragedy from a Jewish point of view. Tacitus would have offered something entirely different. He would have described the conflict through Roman eyes. That missing perspective could answer one of the most important questions in ancient history. In 70 CE, Roman forces captured Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple. The event transformed Judaism forever and profoundly influenced the development of Christianity. Few moments in ancient history carried consequences as far-reaching as the destruction of the temple. But one mystery remains: who ordered it? According to Josephus, Titus never intended to destroy the sacred building. He claimed Roman soldiers ignored their commander's orders, and the temple was consumed by fire accidentally during the chaos of battle. Other ancient writers, however, hint at a very different story. They suggest Tacitus blamed Titus himself. Did the future emperor deliberately order the temple's destruction, or was it truly an accident? Without the missing books of the histories, historians cannot answer with certainty. The disappearance of these chapters illustrates a larger tragedy. Ancient books survived only because generations of medieval scribes painstakingly copied them by hand. If a manuscript stopped being copied even for a short period, it could vanish forever. Sometimes only part of a manuscript survived. Sometimes entire volumes disappeared. In other cases, only brief quotations preserved by later authors remind us that these works ever existed. History itself has often depended upon chance. What survives is not always what was most important, but simply what was fortunate enough to endure. Still, thanks to Tacitus, we possess remarkable portraits of some of Rome's most infamous emperors, political conspiracies, and scandals. Without him, much of what we know about figures such as Nero would have been lost forever. Yet the missing books remind us that even our best historical sources tell only part of the story. Some of history's greatest answers may have disappeared alongside the scrolls that once held them, voices silenced by time. Among the countless figures who shaped the Roman Empire, few lived lives as extraordinary or as dangerous as Agrippina the Younger. History remembers her as the mother of Emperor Nero, but that title barely captures her remarkable story. She was born into the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty, sister to Emperor Caligula, niece and later wife of Emperor Claudius, and the great-granddaughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Few individuals ever stood so close to the center of imperial power for so many years. Agrippina witnessed political intrigue, assassinations, betrayals, and the rise of emperors from a perspective almost no one else could claim. And unlike many women of her age, she appears to have recorded her experiences herself. Ancient writers tell us that Agrippina composed a memoir known as her commentary describing both her own life and the fortunes of the imperial family. Today, that work has completely vanished. Only scattered references survive. Pliny the Elder mentions that Agrippina described Nero's difficult birth, believing the unusual delivery was a terrible omen for his future. Tacitus also confirms that she wrote personal memoirs, probably during the final years of her life. Whether she ever completed them remains unknown. Before long, events overtook her. When Nero became emperor at just 16 years old, Agrippina initially held enormous influence over the young ruler. Many believed she expected to guide the empire through her son's reign. But power inside the imperial palace was fragile. As Nero matured, his desire for independence quickly turned into suspicion. Advisors encouraged him to distance himself from his mother, and political rivals portrayed Agrippina as an obstacle to his authority. Their relationship deteriorated into open hostility. According to the surviving accounts, Nero eventually ordered her assassination. If her memoirs survived, they might reveal how those events truly unfolded not through the eyes of later historians, but from the woman who lived them. That missing perspective is particularly valuable because nearly everything we know about Rome's first imperial dynasty was written decades after the events themselves. The greatest library ever lost throughout history. No library has captured the imagination quite like the Library of Alexandria. Founded in ancient Egypt, it was far more than a collection of books. It was the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world, a place where scholars gathered to study mathematics, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, poetry, and history. At its height, the library may have housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls gathered from across the known world. Yet the greatest treasure of Alexandria was not a single manuscript. It was a book that catalogued every other book. The creator of this extraordinary work was Callimachus, one of the most celebrated scholars and poets of the 3rd century BCE. His masterpiece, known as the Pinax, was far more than a simple inventory. Stretching across an astonishing 120 scrolls, it became the world's first great scholarly catalog. Every entry was carefully organized. Authors were grouped by literary genre. Biographies were included whenever possible. Opening lines were recorded to identify each work. And even the total number of lines was noted so readers could determine whether a manuscript was complete. For the first time in history, knowledge itself had been systematically organized. The Pinax represented an intellectual achievement unlike anything that had existed before. Rather than simply listing titles, Callimachus created a sophisticated reference system that allowed scholars to navigate one of the largest collections of literature ever assembled. His methods became the foundation for later libraries throughout the ancient world. Centuries after his death, librarians were still following principles first established in Alexandria. The Pinax was not merely a catalog. It was a masterpiece of scholarship in its own right. Ironically, the work that documented the world's greatest library would eventually disappear itself. For generations, people believed that the famous Library of Alexandria was destroyed in a single catastrophic fire during Julius Caesar's campaign in Egypt. Modern evidence suggests the reality was far more complicated. Although parts of the city burned during Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, the library, or at least significant portions of it, continued to exist for centuries afterward. The Pinax certainly survived that crisis. Ancient scholars were still using it hundreds of years later. Its eventual disappearance came through a quieter, more familiar process. Ancient books survived only if they continued to be copied by hand. For a work as enormous as the Pinax, that was an expensive undertaking. Copying 120 scrolls required vast quantities of papyrus, countless hours of labor, and considerable financial support. Unlike a poem or a philosophical treatise, the catalog could not easily be summarized without losing much of its value. Gradually, fewer copies were produced. Eventually, none were. And once the last manuscript vanished, the greatest catalog of the ancient world disappeared forever. Its loss was devastating. Without the Pinax, historians cannot know the full contents of the Library of Alexandria. Thousands of books that once filled its shelves may have vanished without leaving even a trace of their existence. Many ancient authors known only by name may have produced dozens of additional works now completely forgotten. Others may have disappeared so thoroughly that we have no idea they ever existed. The Pinax would have transformed countless unknown mysteries into identifiable historical questions. Instead of wondering what has been lost, we would at least know what once existed. The catalog also offered something equally valuable: insight into how the ancient Greeks understood their own literature. Its organization reflected the categories, genres, and scholarly traditions valued by Hellenistic intellectuals. It reveals not only which books they preserved, but how they classified knowledge itself. That perspective is almost as valuable as the books the catalog described. There is another intriguing possibility. Alexandria was more than a Greek city. As one of the world's greatest centers of commerce and learning, it attracted ideas from across Africa, the Near East, and Asia. Many scholars believe the library housed translated works from civilizations beyond Greece. Egyptian religious texts, Babylonian writings, Persian traditions, and perhaps even Indian literature may all have found a place on its shelves. If the Pinax survived today, it could provide evidence for countless works that have otherwise vanished from history. Its pages might reveal connections between civilizations that remain invisible to us. For many historians, the disappearance of Callimachus' catalog represents one of the greatest intellectual losses of the ancient world. Not because it contained the answers to every historical mystery, but because it showed where those answers once existed. It was the map to an entire lost civilization of ideas. And when that map disappeared, countless paths into the ancient past vanished with it. The forgotten heroes of the Trojan War. When people think of ancient Greek literature, two masterpieces immediately come to mind: the Iliad and the Odyssey. For nearly 3,000 years, these epics have defined the legendary world of heroes, gods, and the Trojan War. They shaped Western storytelling and continue to inspire novels, films, and historical imagination. Yet these famous poems once belonged to something far larger. Together, they formed only to surviving chapters of an enormous collection of stories known as the epic cycle. Most of the rest has vanished. Long before these tales were written down, they were passed from generation to generation by traveling poets. For centuries, audiences gathered to hear stories of Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Helen, and countless other legendary figures whose adventures stretched far beyond the events described in Homer's surviving works. Eventually, many of these oral traditions were recorded in writing. Together, they created a vast interconnected narrative that explored nearly every stage of the Trojan War from its legendary origins to its final aftermath. Today, however, almost all of those poems have disappeared. One of the earliest lost epics was the Cyprier. While the Iliad begins late in the war, the Cyprier told the story of everything that came before. It described the divine quarrel that set the conflict in motion, the famous judgment of Paris, when the goddess Eris cast a golden apple marked for the fairest among the Olympian gods. 3 powerful goddesses claimed it as their prize. Paris, Prince of Troy, was chosen to decide the winner. His choice earned him the love of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, but it also doomed his city. Helen's departure from Sparta sparked a conflict that would consume kingdoms and become one of history's greatest legends. Without the Cyprier, much of that story survives only through brief summaries and scattered references written centuries later. Another remarkable lost poem was the Aethiopis. This epic continued the story immediately after the conclusion of the Iliad. With Hector dead, Troy received unexpected allies from distant lands. Among them were the legendary Amazons, a nation of fearless female warriors led by their queen, Penthesilea. Renowned for their courage and skill in battle, the Amazons fought beside the Trojans against the invading Greek armies. According to ancient tradition, Penthesilea herself faced Achilles in single combat, although Achilles ultimately defeated her. Later storytellers claimed he was struck with admiration and even sorrow after realizing the nobility of the warrior he had slain. It is one of antiquity's most tragic and compelling episodes. Yet the complete poem that told this story has vanished. The Aethiopis also introduced another extraordinary hero, Memnon, the king of Ethiopia. Celebrated for his unmatched bravery, Memnon journeyed to Troy to aid King Priam during the city's darkest hour. Like Penthesilea before him, he eventually met Achilles on the battlefield. Their duel became one of the greatest confrontations in Greek legend. Ancient audiences once knew Memnon as one of the Trojan War's greatest champions. Today, however, his story survives only in fragments. Ironically, the authors traditionally credited with these poems may never have existed in the form later generations imagined. Modern scholars believe these epics evolved over centuries through oral performance. Countless anonymous storytellers expanded, reshaped, and refined the legends before they were finally committed to writing. The names attached to works such as the Cyprier or the Aethiopis may represent literary traditions rather than individual authors. Regardless of who composed them, these stories formed an essential part of the ancient Greek understanding of heroism. So why did they disappear while Homer's epics survived? The answer may lie not in quality, but in popularity. Ancient scholars increasingly regarded the Iliad and the Odyssey as the finest examples of Greek epic poetry. As educational systems centered on those two masterpieces, scribes devoted their limited resources to copying them again and again. The remaining poems gradually fell out of use. By late antiquity, many were no longer being reproduced. Once the final copies decayed, the stories disappeared forever. Today, we know their contents only through brief summaries preserved by later writers, leaving enormous gaps in one of history's greatest literary traditions. Their loss has shaped the way we understand Greek mythology itself. Modern audiences often imagine the Trojan War as the story of Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus alone. But the lost epics reveal a far richer and more diverse tradition. They celebrated powerful women who fought beside kings, foreign rulers who became legendary heroes, and countless characters whose voices have almost entirely faded from history. Imagine growing up with Penthesilea standing beside Achilles as one of mythology's defining warriors. Imagine Memnon receiving the same recognition as Hector or Odysseus. Our understanding of heroism, courage, and the ancient world might look very different today. The disappearance of the epic cycle reminds us that cultural memory is never fixed. History is shaped not only by the stories that survive, but also by those that are forgotten. Every lost poem narrowed the window through which later generations would view the ancient world. And somewhere beyond those missing pages remain heroes, adventures, and perspectives that may never be recovered, echoes of a literary universe that once stretched far beyond the epics we know today. Echoes that refuse to die. History remembers its greatest triumphs through the written word. Yet, for every ancient book that survives today, countless others have disappeared beyond recovery. Some were destroyed by fire. Others were lost to war, earthquakes, floods, or simple neglect. But more often than not, the greatest enemy of ancient literature was neither violence nor disaster. It was time. Papyrus decays. Ink fades. Scrolls crumble. Unless each generation chose to copy a manuscript by hand, it slowly vanished from existence. Once the final copy disappeared, the knowledge it contained was gone forever. Many of history's greatest works survived not because they were indestructible, but because they were fortunate. The Roman physician Galen understood this reality well. Writing nearly 2,000 years ago, he observed that libraries could be wiped out by disasters in a single moment. Fires, earthquakes, and conflict repeatedly erased centuries of accumulated knowledge. Yet even those catastrophes explain only part of the story. Most books were never dramatically destroyed. Instead, they quietly slipped into oblivion as readers lost interest, patrons stopped funding new copies, and fragile manuscripts gradually deteriorated beyond repair. History's greatest library was often memory itself, and memory can be fragile. Despite these enormous losses, what has survived remains extraordinary. The historian Edward Gibbon once reflected on the disappearance of the ancient world's libraries with both sadness and gratitude. He lamented the countless facts and stories buried forever beneath the ruins of history. At the same time, he reminded us that chance had preserved the masterpieces already recognized by antiquity as works of exceptional brilliance. Although much has been lost, the books that remain continue to represent some of humanity's greatest achievements. Their survival is nothing short of remarkable. Every surviving manuscript serves as a bridge across thousands of years. Through them, we still hear the voices of philosophers debating virtue, generals describing battles, poets celebrating heroes, and historians attempting to understand the rise and fall of civilizations. These fragile works remind us that the ancient world was not an abstract idea. It was lived by real people whose hopes, fears, ambitions, and mistakes continue to resonate today. For centuries, historians assumed that the search for lost ancient books had largely come to an end. If a manuscript had not been discovered by now, it was probably gone forever. But one extraordinary archaeological site has begun to challenge that assumption. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted with devastating force, burying the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum beneath volcanic ash and rock. Among the villas destroyed by the eruption was a remarkable private library. Hundreds of papyrus scrolls survived, but only because they had been carbonized rather than completely consumed by fire. To the naked eye, they appeared impossible to read. Attempting to unroll them would simply reduce them to dust. For generations, their contents remained locked away. Today, that story is beginning to change. Using advanced imaging technology, powerful particle accelerators, and artificial intelligence, researchers are developing new methods to read the hidden ink trap inside these fragile scrolls without physically opening them. Letters that remained invisible for nearly 2,000 years are slowly emerging from the blackened papyrus. Each successful reconstruction offers the possibility of recovering works that no living person has ever read. Perhaps they contain forgotten philosophical treatises. Perhaps they preserve lost poems. Perhaps somewhere among those tightly rolled scrolls lies a work once believed to have vanished forever. No one knows what discoveries still await. History has surprised us before, and it may do so again. The lost books of antiquity remind us that the past is never entirely silent. Even after thousands of years, buried voices can still speak if we develop the tools to hear them. Every recovered word has the potential to reshape our understanding of the ancient world. Every newly deciphered manuscript narrows the distance between our civilization and those that came before. The greatest mysteries of history are not always hidden beneath forgotten cities or sealed inside royal tombs. Sometimes they exist within stories that were once read by millions, only to disappear through accident, neglect, or the relentless passage of time. Perhaps many of those voices are gone forever,